Olá, sejam bem-vindos ao Relampeio 2021. Eu sou a Ana Meira e estamos aqui no primeiro dia do nosso festival. Essa é a última mesa do dia, né? Para quem não conseguiu ver as mesas anteriores de hoje, tá tudo salvo aqui no nosso canal, então depois corre lá ver. O Relampeio é um festival internacional literário relâmpago que reúne autorias internacionais da fantasia, ficção científica e horror em debates ao vivo e gratuitos transmitidos aqui no YouTube, né? Então, antes da gente começar, eu vou dar alguns avisos para vocês. Primeiro, inscrevam-se aqui no nosso canal e apoiem esse projeto, para que o Relampeio possa continuar nos próximos anos. A gente tem um link aqui do PayPal, que está fixo na descrição abaixo, e também o nosso Pix. Nesse ano, o valor arrecadado, a gente vai apoiar o projeto Tem Gente com Fome. Vocês podem saber mais no site www.temgentecomfome.com.br. É uma iniciativa que tem como objetivo doar cestas básicas para as famílias em situação de risco nessa pandemia. A gente sabe que está muito difícil, né, gente? Então, quem puder apoiar, por favor, ajudem a gente. A gente acredita que a literatura também tem esse papel social. Então, quem sempre puder ajudar, vai ser muito bem-vindo. E a gente também quer lembrar que estamos realizando sorteios de livros para quem acompanha as mesas. Basta preencher um formulário que está aqui também na descrição, vocês conferem tudo. Então, não perca a chance de participar. Bom, recados dados, vou apresentar a nossa mesa. Todo mundo está aqui já. Estamos com a incrível VanderMeer como nossa convidada internacional, os escritores Vicky Vieira e o Arthur Machete, como nossos queridos mediadores da noite. O tema da nossa mesa, vocês já devem saber, mas é ficção weird ou weird fiction. O papo promete ser muito bom, gente. Para quem não conhece o weird ou para quem conhece, eu estou mesmo muito animada, acho que eu vou aprender bastante, espero que vocês também. A gente vai traduzir ao vivo a mesa aqui pelo chat. Então, hoje quem vão estar traduzindo é a Kali, de Los Santos, e a Iana, e no backstage está a Ana Rush. Então, obrigada, gente, por estar ajudando a gente aí hoje. E a gente também só quer pedir a colaboração de todo mundo, como a tradução vai estar acontecendo aí no chat, o chat precisa acontecer devagar. Então, para mandar as perguntas, escreva a palavra pergunta antes, para ficar mais fácil de acompanhar, e para ajudar, né, a mediadora e todo mundo que está precisando de tradução e transcrição para acompanhar a mesa, tá bom? Now I'm gonna switch to English. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. And Arthur, Vicky, I'm really happy to be here, although I'm really nervous. Just before we begin, I'm gonna describe myself physically and also my background, and then I'm gonna ask you all to do the same, please. And also introduce yourselves, okay? Just tell us who you are. So I'm Ana Meira, I'm the host tonight. I'm a light-skinned Black woman. I have curly brown hair up to my shoulders. I have brown eyes, a big smile, I guess. I'm wearing an orange kind of brownish shirt with star pattern and white earphones. And behind me, there's a kind of bookshelf. I'm in an office that isn't actually mine. Anyway, I'm gonna pass it to Vicky. Arthur, and then can you begin?
Hi everyone, my name is Vicky Vieira. I'm a 29-year-old white, non-binary, trans-masculine person. My pronouns are they, them. I have brown eyes, dark brown hair, short hair, and I'm wearing a dark blue button-up shirt. and I'm a writer, I'm a translator. Wait a second, I think my sound is, no, it's working, okay. I love weird fiction and new weird things. I was an adolescent, and I've been publishing stories for about a decade now, and I'm writing a bunch of new stuff that will come out independently in the coming months, so look out for that. And that's it.
Thank you. Arthur, do you want to go?
Well, I'm Arthur Marqueto, as Anna said. I basically write and talk about books. I'm a journalist, podcaster at 30 Min, a PhD student in communication, and I write a few more things in other places. I even had a short story published in Faísca, a flash fiction magazine. If all goes well, until second semester, a project of mine on weird fiction will come off the paper, since I understood this invitation today as a magical sign. Describing myself, I'm a white man with black hair up my shoulder. I don't wear glasses, since everybody on other tables were wearing glasses. I have a short beard and a terrible and giant flaw on my chin, but thankfully unnoticeable.
Okay. Thank you, Arthur. So, Anne, do you want to talk a little bit about you?
Hi, my name is Anne VanderMeer. I'm a 64-year-old white woman. I am very, very short, although you can't tell that when I'm sitting down, because we're all the same when we're sitting, right? You might have seen my cat, Neo. He jumped up here for a little while. He's a black and white cat, but he's gone now. He doesn't always jump up, but when I'm talking on the computer like this, he wants to know what's going on, so he'll jump and he'll get in the way. As for the color of my hair, that's really hard to say. I have changed the color of my hair so many times in the past 4 or 5 years that I'm not really sure what color it is anymore, and I haven't had a haircut in over a year. So my hair is much, much longer than it's been in decades, and all of the color is gone now, so it's kind of bleached out now, except for the new hair that's growing in grew in grayish. So I do have the, well, let's call it silver, okay? Not gray, let's call it silver. And I am downstairs in my office. I have a very interesting lamp behind me, but it's not plugged in, so it doesn't turn on. I still haven't figured out where I want to put it yet, so that's why it's still there. Now, as for what I do, I am an editor and an anthologist. I have been reading and editing fiction for several decades. I want to say about 30 years at least. And I love to read, which is how I got into it. And some of my anthologies are big because I love big books. And weird fiction is my favorite kind of fiction to read and edit and acquire.
Thank you so much, Anne, for being here with us again. Vicky, Arthur. So I believe Arthur wants to begin with a question today.
First of all, we all can see you love big books, then.
Yeah, I was thinking
a lot of big anthologies. But first of all, opening this discussion, we are talking earlier, and we think that weird fiction is a niche genre in Brazil, right? Most readers don't know it's called weird fiction, but know about it through the works of Lovecraft and a few other lesser-known classics that are being translated and published by small publishers in recent years. But even then, a lot of people just call it all horror, or we read and knows weird without knowing what it is, right? Just the feeling, the sensation. So thinking about the public and talking about it in Brazil, we would like to know if you can give us a brief definition of weird fiction, explaining the main elements of this mode of narrative and where it sits historically. Or, like Vic wrote in our script, how would you explain the weird to a grandma who is already dead?
Well, weird fiction is basically supernatural fiction that does not rely on commonly known tropes like ghosts and vampires and things like that. It's really the unknowable and the unseen. And the difference between weird fiction and horror fiction is that weird fiction can be terrifying and scary, but that's not the point. The point with horror fiction is to go for the scare. But the thing about weird fiction is that it's more interested in exploring things that we do not understand. Now, if I were to explain that to a grandmother who is already dead, doing that right there would probably be weird in itself, although the grandmother might be a ghost, in which case, not weird. But essentially, the way that I look at weird fiction, it's a way for us to explore the things that we don't understand in the world around us. And I don't think that there has been a generation ever in all of humanity where we knew everything. There's always something we don't understand that we want to know more about. And to me, the way that I approach weird fiction, some people might see it as like almost seeking religious or spiritual information, because that's what religion is in a way. If you think about it, religion is a way for us to make sense of the world around us, the things that we don't understand. And weird fiction explores that. It's not always scary, but it can seem scary to us because we don't know what it is. And so to me, I feel like exploring weird fiction is something that can span all the generations and all of the centuries, because all fiction in a way is asking those questions, those same questions. Is what does this mean? Why am I here? All of those things. So to me, that's what weird fiction is.
Vic, do you want me to continue with the follow-up question, or?
No, if you want to make the follow-up, you can do, and then right. I'll go to the next one.
Okay. So not just about that scary feeling, but where does science fiction, and I think principally thinking about new weird, maybe fantasy, meets weird fiction?
Well, again, weird fiction comes from the uncanny and the unknowable, and seeking the truth, seeking what it is. And weird fiction can be explored through science fiction. It can be explored through fantasy. It can even be explored through any other genre. It could be mystery. It could be Westerns. It could be even romance or mainstream literary fiction. If you think about it that way, it's just a matter of not knowing something and trying to find out what it is and trying to discover what it is, and not knowing what's behind the door, not knowing what is around the corner. And so when you said earlier that it's like a small little subgenre, I think in some corners people might see it that way, but if you really look at the wider world and you look at some of the other things that are being written, I think that you can find little blossoms of weirdness coming out in all of these other stories. So it might be a science fiction story on the surface, and you're seeing it's a science fiction story on the surface because there's aliens in it, but then something else happens, and it's really, if you look at it closely, it's really weird fiction. So I believe in my mind that weird fiction encompasses so much more than just this small genre, because to me, it encompasses all of the genres. You can look at every single type of fiction that's out there, and I'm sure you can find a story in that genre that has weirdness in it. And the other thing is you find weirdness in real life. I was really struck the other day when I was reading an article in the paper about these divers. They've been doing night dives with cameras. They're photographers that dive in the middle of the night, and they go deep, deep, deep in the water where it's pitch black dark. And they take pictures of things that marine biologists have never seen before. And it's usually little tiny fish larvae. So things that people have never seen. I don't know if you've seen these photographs that they had online. It was last week, I think they posted a bunch of them. And when you look at them, they're weird. They're so weird, but they are absolutely gorgeous. And this is a new discovery here on this planet where we've been here for centuries, right? And, you know, it's a science thing. It's a real thing. It's a factual thing. It's a science-based thing. But yet it's still weird because we're looking at these things that these photographers have taken pictures of, and we don't know what they are. And we don't know what happens to them, what they're going to turn into. And we don't know all those things. So even something realistic like that has that essence of weirdness to it.
And to stay on the topic of diseases and immune systems, there was an article about the immune system and how it's absolutely unknowable. We don't know exactly how the immune system works. We think we know. Sometimes we know how it works with one specific disease, and then comes something like the coronavirus and changes everything completely. So as close as our own immune system, or as far away as the bottom of the sea, we have no idea what's going on most of the time.
Right. That's why they call medicine an art and not a science.
So going to the next question. In the introduction of the weird, you wrote that the weird exists in the interstices, and that the most keenly attuned reader says, I know it when I feel it. So about this feeling, the British writer, theorist, and philosopher Mark Fisher configured it as a montage, the conjoining of two or more things which do not belong together. And in many stories, there is a sense of uneasiness, of something that is slightly out of place in the geometry of reality. And that's how it all starts to unravel for the characters. So can you tell us how weird fiction delves into this I know it when I feel it atmosphere, and then unfolds the strangeness within? And what are the tools that the writers use to accomplish that?
Well, it's really interesting when you say I know it when I see it, but it's also I know it when I don't know it. If you think about it in those terms, because the recognition is really something that you don't recognize. So something is out of place. And you're right, exactly what you're saying there about it's the real world, but then something's a little bit off kilter. You know, it's like if you're walking down the street and you see a dog wearing a dress. Well, maybe that's weird. Maybe it's not weird. It depends on where you live. You know, the dogs in my neighborhood don't wear dresses. But you know, is that scary? Maybe not. Maybe it is. I don't know. But some people might not find that weird. So also, when you say, when someone says, I know it when I see it, it's different for other people. And not only is it going to be different for other people, but their perspectives could change as their experiences change. So I might look at something today and find it completely and totally weird. And then 10 years from now, encounter it again and find it completely normal. So it is in the eye of the beholder, but it is something supernatural that's unexplainable at that time. As soon as you can explain it, then it's not really weird anymore, which is the reason why when we were doing the weird, we didn't put in werewolves and vampires and things like that because we know what they are. They have a set of rules. You know, we've already got like a whole history of what that is. So to us, that's not weird. The weird parts are when you turn the page and you don't know what is going to happen or why.
There's a little bit to do with the intention of the weird thing as well, because if you encounter something that is unapproachable and unknowable and so out of your own reality, you don't know what is the intention of that thing, and you immediately jump to conclusions that that thing wants to do you harm. That's the first thing we think, is the things of self-preservation. So when you were talking about the weird meeting science fiction, I immediately thought about the unknown aggressors in the Expanse novel series. Like it's in their own name, the unknown aggressors. They're these huge entities that nobody knows where they come from, what they are, who they are, what do they want, and it's such a weird element in a series that is a vast space opera, but it's deeply weird.
Right, exactly. And you know, the other thing about that that's very interesting when you look at the history of the weird, people always go back to H.P. Lovecraft and they consider him to be the father of weird fiction. But, you know, people were writing weird fiction long before he was. He just gave it a name, and, you know, the magazine and all that kind of codified it. But his idea and his take when he was writing his view of weird fiction, it was because he was afraid of everything. Everything that wasn't him, he was afraid of. He was afraid of women. He was afraid of people of color. He was afraid of people from other countries. He was afraid of everything. So everything he wrote, it kind of fed into those fears. And so that's why when you read his fiction, it's all horrific. But not all weird fiction is horrific. Sometimes the grotesque is beautiful. And that's why sometimes I get frustrated when people keep putting so much on H.P. Lovecraft when I don't consider him to be the end all and be all. And I do know that a lot of writers were influenced by his writing. But here's the thing about being influenced by someone's writing. Sometimes the way that you're influenced is by knowing what not to do, as opposed to I'm going to write just like this person. So there's all kinds of ways that you can be influenced by somebody's writing. It could give you a spark of an idea, or you could say, oh, I would never do that, and here's why. So if you take a look at a lot of the other stories that are in the Weird Anthology, you'll see a lot of different perspectives on weird fiction, and you'll see a lot of weird fiction from other countries that could not possibly have known what H.P. Lovecraft was writing at that time, because it was, you know, after their time, or in a language that they didn't read. So it is all a matter of the writer's perspective, and then the reader, when they come into it, they're bringing their own perspective into it as well. So the writer, you know, when H.P. Lovecraft was writing those things and people were reading it at that time, it was really creepy and scary. But if you pick it up now, I don't know how scary it is anymore. I mean, you just basically, for me anyway, and I know this is probably a horrible thing to say since I love weird fiction, but when I pick up H.P. Lovecraft's work, it's very difficult for me to get through it because his writing is so turgid. It's just like that, and then there's so many exclamation points and you know, and you know, it's almost to me laughable. So it doesn't age well. Now I take a look at some of the other stories that were in the Weird Anthology, and they're still pretty scary and creepy. They are, you know, so they stand the test of time. And that's one of the things that I look for when I'm working on an anthology and I'm looking at work from 100 years ago. Is it still relevant today?
And as an editor, I imagine you have this vantage point of seeing the historic evolution of, when we talk about things that makes us uneasy and that makes us feel that something's off place, and you read stories from the 19th century and the 20th century, you can see the evolution of what is making their particular society uneasy, what are the social anxieties, and how that translates into the weird. And how have you seen this evolution through your work as an editor?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is that there are certain feelings that are universal throughout all generations. You know, we all have our desires and our wants and our needs, and we all have fears, and they all kind of go back to the same thing. You want to feel you belong, you want to feel safe, and you want to feel love. You know, those are motivations that we're always going to have. And I do also think that human beings just have a natural curiosity, unless it's beaten out of them where they don't ask questions. But I think for the most part, people do have a curiosity and want to learn things. And I think that weird fiction is an answer to that in some ways, because it is an exploration of questions that we want answers to. You know, and it's not just about people outside of us, but I sometimes feel like weird fiction can also be an exploration of the inner you. Like, we'll take for an example Kafka's story, The Metamorphosis. We all know the story; it's very famous. The man wakes up to find out he's a giant cockroach. You know, and it is a story that talks about society and the political situation at the time that he was living in. But there's a lot of interpersonal relationship things in the guy talking to himself and thinking about, who am I? So there's a lot of existential things going on in that story beyond the things that we, learn in school about it. So it's not just an external thing. When you're reading weird fiction, it's also internal. We're asking questions about who you are.
Yeah, and I read Metamorphoses again recently. I read first when I was an adolescent, and I had a very particular experience with a book that was all about the monster and the weird things in it. And then when I read again as an adult, it's such a tragic, sad book. I was very, very moved by it, and it really hit me really hard. So yeah, Arthur, you want to go?
Yes, keeping that line of thought. We were talking earlier about the grotesque in weird fiction, right? There's a writer called Istvan Chicheri Ronai. I don't even know if it's pronounced that way. I think it is. That talks about the grotesque, meaning the mix of things that do not belong together in a physical sphere, right? Not just in a mental sphere or abstract sphere. Thinking even about this mutation in anomalous bodies and objects, as we are saying right now about Kafka, right? And the struggle to accommodate the unstable world. So how would you describe the configuration of this badly fitting feeling in the weird? And how does it change when these stories are being written by people whose bodies are marginalized or even considered grotesque?
Well, again, I think it goes back to the eyes of the beholder, because the weird fiction does often take a close look at the body. And one of the writers that comes to mind automatically is Kathy Koja, who wrote an amazing book called Skin, that the main character spends a lot of time doing body modifications, and it really explored that a great deal. And when you look at something that's different from what you're used to, you might see it as being grotesque. But after a while, it can be beautiful. So you can certainly explore it that way as well. It's a matter of what you're used to seeing. And it also reminds me, forgive me for this, but it does remind me of a Twilight Zone episode that was actually called Eye of the Beholder. I believe that was the title of the episode. And if you've ever seen it, there's this woman who is having surgery on her face. And they're doing plastic surgery to fix her face because she's grotesque. They think she's grotesque. And they're taking the bandages off after the surgery, and they're holding a mirror to her so she can see what she looks like. And when we see her, she's this beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed woman. But they all cringe in horror because she's still grotesque to them. And when they show the rest of the characters, the doctors and the nurses, all their faces are different. And so I keep thinking about that particular episode because it is in the eye of the beholder. Because here's this woman who, in certain areas, she would be considered a conventional beauty. But in the world that she was living in, she was considered grotesque. So it's really a matter of that. What is normal? And how do we define what normal is? Well, I think in some cases it's what you're used to seeing. So if you're in an environment where there are differently abled people around you all the time, it's very common and usual for you, and you don't see anything different or strange. But if you've never encountered that before, if you've never sat down next to somebody who didn't have a left arm, then you would find that to be unusual. So that's something that can also be explored in weird fiction. But again, what is normal and what is weird?
Last year, we also talked about points of view, right? The perspectives, the different lives. Vicky has a next question that I think that fits pretty well in this moment.
Yeah, so talking about weird body configurations, in many stories, space and time itself are broken or distorted in ways that are almost incomprehensible to the human mind. And so the characters can only see bits and pieces of it through their own emotional and psychological filters. And I remember, I have to quote him because I love this man. I remember Guillermo del Toro talking about ghosts as metaphors for the past, but the way he creates his ghosts, for example, on Crimson Peak, which is a Gothic romance, those are very organic ghosts, full of fluids and plasticity, and they're very kind of tangible distortion of time in a way. So can you talk about how weird fiction bends and breaks space and time in that sense?
How does weird fiction bend space and time? Well, I think it comes back to a question of who you are and where you are. You know, thinking about ghosts as metaphors and the body. You think about, there was this book that I read many years ago called The Tenant by Ronald Topor, Topor, The Tenant. And in that book, one of the characters is exploring some philosophical question. He said, if I had my head cut off, is it me and my body, or is it me and my head? And I still remember that one question in that book. I don't remember a lot about that book, but I remember that one question is who is me? Am I my body or am I my head? And what does that mean? So that's something that I think that weird fiction does explore, because it does actually make you look inside yourself and think about what that means, because we all have things going on in our lives, and we all have different challenges that we have. But who are we really? I mean, what part of our body defines who we are? Sure, it defines who we are as far as how people see us, but how does it define who we are as how we see ourselves? And is that okay? You know, is it okay that we're using that as a way to define ourselves or not? And definitely you can do that with weird fiction. And you can explore it beyond just fiction and the written word. I have a nephew who is a professional dancer, and he does a lot of work with all kinds of dancers around the world, and they all have different bodies. And he loves to explore doing different dances with these people and working with them and having them choreograph with him what works with their bodies. And he explores that a lot with dance. And you might take a look at some of the dances that he's choreographed and put together with these very different dancers, and you might find it to be weird and strange and unusual, because it's not the typical ballet or tap dance. But I look at what my nephew does, and I think it's absolutely beautiful, because he explores all these different abilities that these dancers have. And notice I'm saying abilities, because they all have abilities. And it's not just their dance abilities, but their abilities to imagine what the dance should look like. And so that goes back to writers as well. When a writer is sitting down to write a story, they're imagining what the possibilities are of what could be when they put words on paper.
Thinking about, sorry.
I was going to say, and they think about their characters. Each character has its own point of view. So just like pioneers, dancers have their point of views, the writers' characters have their own point of views.
I was just thinking about that time travel. Mark Fisher, in his books, The Weird and the Eerie, he wrote a chapter of the book called Caught in the Coils of Ouroboros. He was analyzing the book The Anubis Gates from Tim Powers, and he talks about the weird effect triggered when the time travel stories involves time paradoxes. I would like to know if you agree with it, because he says that since he's seeing the weird as a montage, the conjoining of two things that don't belong together, he sees the weird when time travels involve paradox plunks. Like in this book in specific, this guy time travels to search for his preferred writer, but he don't find him, and he writes a book about not finding him, and he later realizes that the book he wrote is the book he knew the writer, right? Do you think that the weird effect is present in this moment, in this time paradox?
In what you've described in that book, I'm trying to see what the weird would be in that. Okay. If I were to stretch, the fact that he's seeking something could be considered weird, but I don't really see anything uncanny or unknowable in his sense, because he has in his mind, he thinks he knows what it is that he's looking for. You see what I'm saying? And so that's different than seeking an answer to something you don't know. So I'm not 100% on board with that necessarily being weird fiction. That's not to say you can't have a time travel story that's weird, because you certainly can. But I don't know if that meets the definition. But hey, to each his own, right?
Yeah, I ask it because of it. Very different points of view on weird fiction.
And that's fine. That's why Baskin Robbins has 34 flavors. Ice cream.
So, Anne, back again in the anthology. You published it 10 years ago, right? You both finished the introduction saying that the weird had fragmented again after New Weird. You said that maybe it will turn into some kind of next weird, right? So what do you think of it now? Do you see any name, groups, patterns, or is it still fragmented?
Well, I don't know so much that it's fragmented as much that it has seeped into everything. Like what I was saying earlier about how it's in all the genres, I think that it has seeped into almost every type of fiction that you can think of. And it's also seeped into our daily lives. You know, you see that a lot. You see that in the news, all kinds of weird things. And it was like Vic was saying earlier about the immune system and the things that we don't know. So I think it's broken through, and it's not just fiction anymore. I think that there is weirdness in our daily lives, and if we take a step back and pay attention, we'll see it. And it could be a glorious thing for us if you look at it that way, or it could be terrifying. But there's so much out there that we don't know about. So fragmented? No, I think it's seeped through everything. I think it's just kind of, you know, the world has soaked it up.
Who nowadays? So, who are you reading? Which books? Which authors?
Oh gosh. Well, you have to understand that when I'm not reading for an anthology, I'm usually reading way out of right now. The book I'm reading right now is a nonfiction book of essays by J.M. Brommer, and it's called Hola, Papi. It's a collection of his essays, and it's absolutely hilarious and devastating at the same time. He's a Mexican-American gay man here living in, I think he lives in New York now, but he grew up in Oklahoma, if you can imagine that. And he writes these essays about what it was like coming out and living in that world. And I am loving his writing right now a lot. I will do that a lot where I'll read nonfiction and essays and things like that, just to kind of get out of fiction when I'm not reading for a project. But I am reading a lot of short fiction for Tor.com. And I don't know if you saw, but last week I had a story published by a Nigerian writer named Pemi Aguda, and it's called Masquerade Season, and it's on Tor.com if you want to take a look at that. That's a fantastic story, and I have several more fantastic stories coming up this year as well. So I guess you could kind of call Pemi's story weird. It might not be weird to a Nigerian audience because it would be very normal to them, but an American audience might find it very strange. I thought it was a beautiful story about a son's love for his mother and what he would do for her. So that was my take on it. So yeah, I'm reading Ola Papi, and right before I finished that book, read that book, I was reading Lydia Millett's book, The Children's Bible. And that's kind of a post-apocalyptic, ecological, dystopian book. And let me tell you, that book was weird too. That was definitely a weird book.
So I want to go back to two things about because when we talk about weird fiction for people that only know weird fiction, for example, through Lovecraft's works, people tend to think about the big elements of cosmic horror. Those are kind of the most popular elements for people that don't necessarily read a lot of literature, but for example, fans of the first season of True Detective, when you talk about that, you talk about cosmic horror being seeped into a kind of story that has nothing to do with weird, but has a lot to do with weird. So when you think about the elements of cosmic horror in weird fiction and how we can dialogue with philosophical questions of cosmic pessimism, but not necessarily a pessimism that is nihilistic, but just in the sense of putting the human condition in perspective in an indifferent universe that is mostly hostile to human life or to life in general as we know it. How does the weird deals with that? And can you give us examples of stories that go deeper into this exploration, this darker exploration of cosmic horror?
Let's think about that. Well, when you talk about popular fiction, what comes to mind immediately is the TV series Lovecraft Country, which really isn't about Lovecraft, but it just kind of gloms on to some of those initial ideas and it takes off from there. And that definitely explores those types of things. It goes back in time and really explores some of the history of America, which is very, very sad and very, very bad, and how we're trying to deal with it today. And I think that that's one way that weird fiction can help move things in a more positive direction, is when we take a look at our past and really confront it and then move towards making things better. If that makes any sense. That Lovecraft Country is still on my mind because there was a lot of things in there that I didn't understand, and I read more about what the showrunner was doing when they were putting that show together. So I thought that was done very well. Trying to think of some other things that let me take a quick look at my table of contents here. There's one story that was actually an excerpt from a novel by an Iranian writer called Reza Negarestani. And in his story, oil is actually a sentient being. It's actually alive. And just the idea of approaching it that way, of oil being alive, just that alone opens up all these different possibilities. Because when you think about the things that go on in the Middle East and how important oil is, it's like liquid gold, et cetera, and it gives you all these things. I love the way that Reza was able to take a look at that through those kind of eyes. So his novel is called The Dust Enforcer, and his name is Reza Negarestani. So that's a writer you definitely want to look for if you can find him. He hasn't written a lot lately, but that particular one really struck me quite a bit. There's another, some of the other writers. Let me take a quick look. And you take a look at a writer like Lisa Tuttle. She's an American writer who lives in England, and she wrote a story called The Replacements, which is a very unusual kind of a science fiction-y type of story. And that also is a different take on how you see yourself and who's real and who's not real and who's normal and who's not normal. So that's another story that I really like quite a bit. Gosh, that's a tough question because I really have to go back and think about that to come up with a better answer for you. So I apologize, but I would definitely look up Reza Negarestani. You can find his book. It's really worth it.
I remember reading something about him, but it wasn't about this story. It was, I think, another book of his called Cyclonopedia. Do you know about it?
Yes.
Yes.
He does a lot of things, and he doesn't just write fiction. I mean, he's a huge brainiac. He does a lot of things. He gives lectures, and he's really a marvelous writer. So.
Yeah, I think you can find them. A lot of weird fiction writers, they use this different view of the world to think about the world in a way that makes us think about the world different and understand things different, and especially in regards to this big ecological thinking and this big ecological revolution that is going on now. So, I mean, of course, you know this. VanderMeer is doing so much with this kind of ecological thinking and ecological transformation. So, yeah.
Right. I think everybody's thinking about that a lot. And if you take a look at the publishing landscape right now, almost every single book that's coming out now has something to do with climate change, because you can't really ignore it. You can't look away for it. You can't write a book in present day that doesn't address it because it's around us all the time, you know. And so when you read some of these books, you don't know if they're in the present day or if they're 10 years from now, but it is something that has to be addressed. And you know, another example of a book that you could look at, and excuse me for touting my husband's book, but Annihilation and the whole Southern Reach series, they are definitely, to me, weird fiction. And here's the thing about that, because in his books, what's happening in Area X is that the environment is changing. The physical environment is changing, but it's actually cleaning up. So it's like all the pollution is going away and it's transforming and becoming something different. And when you first look at it, you think this is a horrible thing. It's like whenever you approach something that is not something you're used to, you automatically go onto the defense. You know, is it going to kill me? And the thing that's interesting about those books is that what's happening in Area X, the humans think it's something that's this horrible thing, but it's just the natural development of what that creature is or what those beings are. That's just their natural way of life. So to them, it's very normal. But to the humans, it looks very strange. But it is a whole question about what's happening in the environment. When you take a look at the world around you and you see squirrels playing outside or birds doing this and that, you watch their behavior and you might find it to be very strange because you don't understand what it is that they're doing. And they probably think the same thing about us, you know. And we're probably even stranger because at least their behaviors follow some kind of certain, you know, instincts or notions, whereas God knows what we're thinking when we do anything. But those books definitely deal with the uncanny. And the thing is also that I don't find those books to be depressing. I don't find them to be, I find them, they could be optimistic because yes, the world is changing, but is that necessarily a bad thing? You know? I don't know.
Yeah, it goes back to the question of, sorry, I just want to
keep going.
A quick comment. No, I just want to say that it goes back to the question of we are always looking at things from the human perspective. When you know, even when you try to find life in other planets, we look for life that looks like life on Earth, carbon-based, that needs a certain amount of sun and a certain amount of water. If we find some other kind of life we don't even know to recognize as life, we won't know. We would just go right past it. So yeah, you can go ahead.
I was just grabbing this hook because we wrote a question about this, our recent crisis, right? Thinking about that power that the weird has to call into question the way we organize and perceive the world. We would like to know, how do you think that the weird reflects these recent crises, like ecological ones, political ones, and even narrative ones? Yeah, I guess that we are also coming through a narrative crisis, maybe. How does the weird could help us make sense of this world that is increasingly absurd, overwhelming, overcomplicated, incomprehensible, changing?
Well, I don't know if writing or reading weird fiction is going to help us answer those questions, but it is just an exploration of those things. I'm thinking about a story that I published last year by a writer named Brenda Peinato, and it's called The Touches. And it is a science fiction story, but to me it was a weird story because that's what I like, that's what I buy. And in her story, it's a future society where people are completely divorced from their bodies. They're because of disease, they have to live in these clean environments, and they have these avatars that are out in the world. So they have clean, which is where their physical bodies are, and then dirty, which is where their avatars are. It's a really interesting story because it's called The Touches, because human beings aren't able to actually physically touch each other because they might become ill if they do, which to me, and it's so funny because when she wrote that story, it was long before COVID. And it just so happened that it was published like a year or so before COVID happened, before the pandemic. But I go back to that story a lot and I think about it and how she came up with that idea. But also what I love about that story is the whole idea about the separation between the body, the physical body, and the mind that's living out in the world in these avatars doing their routine work. But then the physical body is like locked away somewhere, kept safe. And I thought that was extremely interesting way to look at humanity, So there's another story that you might want to check out that's on Tor.com, so anyone can read it. It's called The Touches by Brenda Peinato.
Vicky, would you like to keep going?
Yep. I was waiting to see if we're gonna do a follow-up, but okay.
No.
So, Anne, I don't know if you remember, but in November of last year, we had a conversation about New Weird, and I remember saying that something like, we were talking about how the weird is in our bodies, how biology is weird, and everything is seeping with the weird. And I said something like, well, the weird is coming for you. And then you completed a sentence saying, well, whether you want it or not, it's coming. And I love this inevitability of how strange things are, how it's in us, how we are deeply strange as well. And there's another thing from Mark Fisher that I want to quote because I love this specific quote. He says, quote, "There is no inside except as a folding of the outside. The mirror cracks. I am an other and I always was," unquote. And we have talked about this a little bit already, but I wanna hear more from you. How the idea of a strange other, that sometimes it's an exterior threat and sometimes it's an interior otherness, how this idea has evolved in weird fiction.
Well, I think it's always been in fiction, and every writer is going to approach it differently. Because here's the thing, when you're writing fiction, as a writer, you really have to inhabit your characters. So you have to become the other. Of course, all of your characters are going to have bits and pieces of yourself and people that you know. But overall, every character that the writer is writing is a completely separate entity that they have to inhabit. So it's like putting themselves in somebody else's shoes. And as a reader, the reader is doing the same thing. When a reader reads a story, they're connecting with the characters in one way or another. They're either very, close to the characters, or they want to push the character away because there's something repulsive about the characters. But that's a way, in a sense, with fiction, for people to play with being other characters in a way. Because when you're reading a story, especially if it's told in first person, you become that character and you're going through these things. And you might say, well, I never would have done that, or why did he say this or that and the other? But it is a way for you to kind of, in a sense, put on another persona. And regardless of how confident somebody is or how many years they've lived on this planet, I think that deep down, all of us have insecurities and are not sure about certain things. And all of us ask ourselves, did I do the right thing? Did I make the right decision? This and that and the other. And so when you talk about the other, sometimes we are the other to ourselves. And sometimes we look out and see people that we thought were other, and then we realize they're really us. So fiction allows us to do that in a safe space because we're not actually engaging with another human being physically. We're doing it in our head, basically. And in a sense, I feel like doing that with fiction can help you overcome fear so that in the real world, you feel like, well, I've already experienced it in these stories, so now I can experience that in the real world, and maybe I have permission to go out and do this, or to go out and be this, or to try that, or it's almost like it allows you that ability because you've experienced it through the fiction. Does that make any sense? Okay. Sometimes
and also,
I'm just babbling.
oh, come on, you can talk as much as you want. We love to hear you. So talking about what is sometimes repulsive and we don't want to get close to that in a story, also that's the beauty in the weirds as well, because in the weirds we can read something that is apparently repulsive and grotesque, but at the same time it's beautiful and enchanting, and we want to get close to it and be part of that different intelligence, that different mind. I mean, come on, what is it about giant tentacles and sentient mushrooms and unknowable primordial entities of chaos that brings us all together, right? It's just the weird that does this.
Right, right.
Changing the subject a little, we were talking about Lovecraft Country, for example, and Vicky and I were thinking about the literature, the weird literature, and the ability to explore the abstract, the philosophical, the ontological thought, right? The proper limity of the language itself, finding those borders and liminal spaces of what can be described and how, right? But we also see the weird in other medias like TV series, games, movies. Like you said, it's always been there, right? So how do you see the exploration of this sensation in other medias?
Well, I'm glad to see it in other things. I also see it in advertisement. I don't know if you've seen any weird commercials or things like that. So it really has seeped into popular culture, so to speak. And I'm glad to see that because I'm hopeful that by people seeing it in ways that are easier for them through movies or TV or video games, that it might lead them to maybe want to go to the source and to maybe want to read the fiction. Because I do worry that there's not enough people out there reading. And, I've had this argument with many people over the years about books are dead, books are dead. Well, we know books aren't dead. We could always have more readers. And if watching a TV show gives somebody the incentive and the motivation to pick up a book and read it, that's great. I love that, And they're going to notice when they do that, that it is a different experience when you pick up a book than when you see it on a screen. Because it's watching it on a screen, to me, it's a passive thing. You're sitting back and letting it happen to you. But when you're reading a book, you're actively engaged with it. And you actually have to do some work. And it's not hard work, but it is work. It's not the same as sitting back and letting someone entertain you. You are part of that experience of the writing of the book, in a sense. The writer, of course, has put the words on the page, and they have certain expectations of what they think the reader is going to see, and you may or may not see what the writer intended, and that's okay. That's okay. And so that's why all of this weirdness that you see all around in the world, if it brings us more readers, that's always a good thing.
I started to think about it when I watched the Annihilation movie, and I was thinking about how would they put on screen the keeper that lives inside the tower? It's almost impossible to put that in images, right? That's the thing that I think that is between those different languages, right? The limits of the way of talking about it, thinking about it, developing it, the weird, right?
Right. Well, of course, when you're watching a movie that's based on a book, the movie is going to be the director and the screenwriter's interpretation of the book. And it might just be an inspiration of the book. It might not even be as closely related to the book as you would think. But it has to be a different thing, because it is a different thing. You know, you're never going to find a movie that was based on a book be exactly like the book. There's always going to be people that are pissed off that it's not like the book. Well, it's just, that's the way it is. It's not supposed to be. It's not supposed to be, you know. But if you can at least have the right atmosphere and the right flavor to it, then it's a bonus. But if watching the movie brings more readers to the book, yay, right? But I am very interested in looking at what filmmakers do and the stories that they tell. And I've been enjoying a lot of, well, haven't we all been enjoying a lot of movies and TV lately? Last night I watched the new Godzilla versus King Kong. We haven't finished it because it's a very long movie, but I'm going to finish it tonight. But yeah, that was a very interesting take on that story.
Yeah, I haven't watched this yet, but I agree. We are watching a lot of television. Guys, we have 30 minutes, so I'm gonna bring it up some questions from the public, okay? The first one is, how are different human science, such as anthropology and linguistics, represented in read fiction, and how they could contribute to this literature?
Now, what's that question again? I'm sorry.
Okay. So we were talking about... okay. Yeah, great.
Okay. How are different human sciences, such as anthropology and linguistics, represented in weird fiction? Okay, well, anthropology and linguistics. Okay, there is a story written by Jeffrey Ford called The Weight of Words. So you want to talk about linguistics, that's a perfect story that talks about linguistics. And I'm sure that there's other stories. Ted Chiang, the one that was made into the movie. I can't remember the name now of his story.
I think it's Story of Your Life.
Yeah, The Story of Your Life. Okay, that definitely explores linguistics, because it's all about language and how, and again, it goes back to the language is not just the words on paper, but it's also the culture and the people behind the language. So definitely you can see that exploration in weird fiction. And anthropology is the study of people. So yeah, absolutely. Because especially when you have weird fiction looking at different versions of people or life, so to speak, that would be brought into weird fiction as well.
Carol Kivato is also saying that China Mieville's fiction Embassy Town has a lot of linguistics in it. And she had another question, which is, sometimes I think weird fiction as a way of broadcasting any given subject, like this story, Embassy Town from China Mieville's, and in space opera, which is a space opera, but also weird. Kraken, a detective story, also weird. How do you see it? And is it more to do with a personal point of view, or like you were saying, the theme itself?
Well, I mean, I have to be honest with you, I'm not that familiar with those books of China's. I'm more familiar with the short fiction. And
Okay.
but I do know that China loves language, and he loves to explore and experiment with language. That's one thing about him. And I can definitely see him using language as a way, it's almost like a character itself. And I've seen other writers do that as well. And I think about Anthony Burroughs, who wrote Clockwork Orange, where he had a whole other kind of slang going on in there. So I can definitely see that as a way to approach your characters, because it's not just a matter of the different words and the language that they're using, but each character is selecting to represent themselves by the words that they use in their dialogue and in their thoughts. So yeah, and China definitely does like to play with language a lot. Some weird fiction will be very sparse in its language and be very precise in its language, and some of it will be very florid and have a lot of descriptors in it. And it does go back to each writer is going to approach it differently. But here's another thing. Sometimes a writer is going to approach different stories differently. You might not necessarily see them approach every story the exact same way. So you might not necessarily say, oh, well, that's this style or that's that style. And you usually can tell if it's a particular writer, but they might be doing something different. So like, for example, with China's story, Kraken, I know that he approached that completely differently than he did with Embassy Town. The way that he pared down the language in Kraken and explored it, expanded it more in Embassy Town. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope so.
Yeah, going.
Anna, if I can make just one quick comment.
Yeah, please.
Just to say something about China Mieville, because he's one of my favorite authors of all time. And I remember distinctly when I first read Perdido Street Station, I was around 20 years old. That was almost 10 years ago. And it definitely changed my brain. It changed how it works, how it's wired. And I've been reading and writing differently ever since. And now that it's been about 4 or 5 years that I'm working professionally with translation, and I feel already that even my work with translation is very different because of my familiarity with weird fiction, reading and writing weird fiction. So yeah, language is absolutely important in it.
Mm-hmm. I never thought about that, about when you have to deal with that. A lot of translators have challenges when they have to translate fiction that really plays with language a lot, because it's tricky to be able to do the translation and still think about all the cultural references behind it, and then what that means to the characters and the world that they're living in. But that's really a particular challenge with weird fiction, especially when you're dealing with linguistics like that.
Yeah, it's a nightmare, and I love every second of it.
No, I have to tell you a funny story. My husband's ambergris books were recently picked up to be reissued by his new publisher, and they were doing the the audiobooks for the ambergris books, and one of the actors who was reading the audiobook didn't know how to pronounce some of the words. And he was asking Jeff all these questions about, well, how do you say this and how do you say that? And Jeff wrote those books 20 years ago. And he's like, well, I made all those words up, so you can pronounce them however you want. And I thought that that was really funny because as translators, I know y'all come across this where you're translating something and the writer made a word up, right? Yes. And then what do? You know, you have to try to get the flavor behind it, but it's still a made up word. And it was so hilarious seeing Jeff struggle with that, going, oh my gosh, I made that word up, you know. It's like, that's what you get. But yeah, all of his poor translators that had to translate those books, they had the same problems. It's just, it was a long time ago and he doesn't remember.
Oh, okay, so going to the other question. Is Could the Willows by Algernon Blackwood, sorry for pronunciation, be considered as weird fiction, even though it's similar in tone with Lovecraft?
Oh yeah, it's definitely weird fiction because these two guys going down the river and strangeness happens. You know, and if I remember correctly, that predates Lovecraft as well. But it's considered a classic story. And I believe that it's actually still taught in schools. I mean, maybe not, but, you know, that is a story that people bring up a lot and it's very well known. But the thing about that also is here they are going down this river and they see things around them starting to change. And it's a very slow kind of a change. And at the same time, stuff is going on in their minds. And so it's almost like, is it really changing or they just think it is? Is there something wrong with them? So there's a lot of things that you can explore in that particular story, which is why I point to something like that before I even point to a Lovecraft story if you want to explore weirdness from back then.
And the last one was Edgar Allan Poe the first to attempt to systemize weird in literature critique? What did he seek to discuss in his How to Write a Blackwood article?
You know, I don't know, but I will tell you this about Poe. He was one of the first writers of that type of fiction that was translated into other languages. So a lot of other writers in other countries were introduced to that type of fiction through reading his work. And so that's one of the things that I know for sure is true. And I believe, I want to say he did some translations too, but I could be wrong about that. But yeah, he was one of the writers that was widely translated throughout the world and one of the few. And I believe one of the most pronounced ones that was writing dark work that way. And you can see his influence in a lot of other writers coming out at that same time period and even afterwards. And it's interesting that he still continues to influence people today. You know, and again, we go back to influence and what does that really mean? I mean, is someone going to write in his style, or is it a feeling that they're trying to evoke that they felt when they read his work? You know, that's another thing. It's like a writer thinking, well, I want to make my readers feel the way I felt when I read Edgar Allan Poe the first time, when I read, you know, the Raven, or when I read, you know, any of his other works. So he was a huge influence on world literature, I want to say.
Yeah, that's really crazy because I study Portuguese and English also in the university, and one of the first authors that we read was Edgar Allan Poe in Portuguese. So anyway, so you guys have any other final remarks? We are almost in the end of our panel today. So Vicky, Arthur, do you have any other final remarks or questions?
Would you like to ask that last question in our script?
Yeah, actually, I had another question in mind. So I can make this other question and it's first time you do the last one. I don't know. So it's a very quick one, because while Annie was talking about this story where they go through the river and things start changing very slowly, and you kind of don't know if it's really changing in the outside world, if it's the characters that are changing how they perceive things. There's a lot of stories that deal with madness and different modes of perception because of neurodiversity in the characters. Is that a way of not necessarily identifying or classifying, but kind of understanding a story that explores a lot of these madness and different perspectives through the weird, but it is actually weird, and it's not just, or maybe it's a story that is, like I said, it's a contemporary fiction, and it's kind of weird because everything seeps in it right now. Is there any kind of border, or it's really all seeped in the weird right now when we talk about different modes of perspective and perception?
I think that fiction has always explored the inner mind and what is real and what is madness and how we define that, and you see that through all kinds of literature, and unfortunately, sadly, many times what you see is the way that people are given these perspectives where they're told that there's something wrong with their brains because they don't think the way that other people do, and then they're left with questioning themselves. And you see that in a lot of literature, and most of the time what you see is it's a woman who's trying to live an independent life, and then society tells her she's wrong. And it's not always that, but I see that a lot in literature where there's a character that's trying to live their lives in their true way and what's true and right for them, and then the people around them or society around them tells them it's wrong, and there's got to be something wrong with their brain. So you do see a lot of that explored in weird fiction, and what's sad is that many of the writers that were writing those things were writing them because they were trying to feel comfortable in their own skin, like and justify the feelings and the way that they wanted to live their lives. And the other thing that was sad to me during the time when I was doing the research for that book is that I read how many of those writers at that time lived short lives, lived very rough lives, and died alone and penniless. And we look at their work now and we hold them up and, oh, this is so wonderful, but we didn't take care of them at the time. And I think it's important for us to embrace the writers today. We may not understand everything, but to have a recognition of what they're trying to do and to have a respect for what they're trying to do, and not have an expectation that everyone needs to be the same. Because what we considered madness back then, we consider brilliance today. So what do we consider madness today? Is that going to be brilliant in 20 years? So I don't think we should be as quick to judge. And I do think that weird fiction is a perfect place to explore how you might perceive those things, madness or just a different perspective.
And we have just a really final question for you, really quick, which is from Ileana Vargas from Mexico. She's another author that is going to be here in Relampio Festival. So it's been a great chat. So which weird fiction authors are your current favorites, Anne?
It's really hard for me to just
hard one.
It's really hard for me to pick just certain weird authors. I mean, not all the authors that write weird fiction write only weird fiction is another thing too. And okay, one writer that I really love is his name is Kai Ashante Wilson. Not everything he writes is weird, but I love everything he writes. His name is Kai Ashante Wilson, and you can find a lot of his fiction online. And he's one of my favorites. Another writer who I absolutely adore, who writes the most sublime weird fiction that I can even imagine, is a Swedish writer by the name of Karin Tidbeck. Karin Tidbeck. They're another fantastic weird fiction writer. And they have short fiction. They also have a new novel that just came out called The Memory Theater, I think it's what it's called. And so those are some writers that I really love. And gosh, I love a lot of writers, but those come on straight to my head right there. Does that help?
Yeah, so actually, not my question, but I think it's a really good way to begin. And so we're almost in the end, guys. So I'm really glad I'm here. I saw a lot of good comments, amazing comments here, praising this panel. So thank you, Anne, for being here. Vicky, Arthur, it was really amazing. I'm now gonna, before I go switch to Portuguese, do you guys want to give any final remarks?
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me. I always love talking to you guys. You challenge me with great questions, and you make me afterwards want to go back and do more research so I can be better prepared next time. But I love your questions, and I love talking to you. It's always so much fun, and I really learn a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. It's always a pleasure talking to you too. And thank you, Anna. Thank you, Arthur. It was incredible and amazing, and I'm so happy. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, I would like to thank you all for this conversation, right? It's been amazing, an awesome table.
One of these days, right?
And I noted here that you said when you come back again, so let's make this happen.
We are already expecting, yes. So now I'm gonna switch to Portuguese again. Thank you so much. To give some final remarks. Obrigada, gente, por estarem aqui assistindo a gente. Essa foi a última mesa do dia. Uma coisa que eu queria falar, se vocês puderem curtir esse vídeo aqui, tá? Além de seguir nossos canais, vai ajudar a gente bastante. E eu queria falar também que amanhã vai ter mais relampeio. Hoje é a última mesa, mas amanhã vai ter mais mesas até dia 4, então fiquem ligados, tudo bem? Amanhã de manhã a gente tem um café da manhã, então se vocês puderem também ver isso nas nossas redes sociais, acompanha que vai estar rolando bastante coisa legal. Então, obrigada por estarem aqui até agora. Quero também agradecer nossas tradutoras e o pessoal do backstage. Não sei se vocês vão aparecer aqui para dar um oizinho para a gente. A Kali, Ana... E a Ana aparecendo, a Ana Rush. É um trabalho com muitas mãos, então a gente tem que agradecer todo mundo que está participando do relampeio, e todo mundo que está assistindo. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. E é isso, espero que a gente se veja amanhã de novo, hein? So, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Ok. Tchau, tchau, gente. Até amanhã.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.